Some US states have legalized cannabis use. Others impose tough penalties on offenders. But many in neighboring countries believe that legalization is the only way to bring drug cartel violence under control. In the second of two special reports, Bob Abeshouse heads south to find out why.
Adults can buy recreational marijuana legally in Colorado today, and reformers hope it's the beginning of a wave that will sweep across America. But in places like Louisiana and the southern United States, legalization is off the agenda. The state has the country's highest incarceration rate.
Marijuana prosecutions are very, very common in Louisiana.
Donna Wiedenhoff is a public defender in New Orleans.
Are the penalties here severe for marijuana possession?
Absolutely. You can get anywhere up to 20 years if you get caught with marijuana 3 times. And in some cases, you can even get life.
Bernard Noble, one of Wiedenhoff's clients, was sentenced to 13 years in jail last year after he was stopped with 2.8 grams of pot, about 3 marijuana cigarettes.
When Bernard was riding his bike, the New Orleans Police Department saw him, and they thought that he had swerved his bike onto the sidewalk to avoid them, almost hitting a car. So they stopped Bernard at that point, and that's pretty much where Bernard's nightmare began.
Noble was riding to a sweet shop. In the past, he had been arrested for possessing small amounts of pot and cocaine. His most recent arrest was 9.5 years before.
Is Bernard Noble a drug dealer?
Bernard Noble's not a drug dealer, no.
Was Bernard Noble ever arrested for violent offenses?
Bernard Noble has never been accused of a crime of violence.
The judge in Noble's case assessed his character in the offense and sentenced him to 5 years in prison, still serious time for 3 joints. But after the New Orleans district attorney appealed 3 times, the Louisiana Supreme Court ordered Noble to prison for 13 years. Derwin Bunton is the chief public defender in New Orleans.
We in the South are part of what is called the Bible Belt, a very Christian part of the country. And that has produced some very conservative values that play themselves out in our criminal justice system. There's also the history of slavery and racism in the South.
Do you think the fact that district attorneys and judges are elected plays a role in the tough pot possession penalties here?
I think that's played a big part in sentencing. It becomes easy to sort of make a political name prosecuting very vigorously drug offenses.
He just was so concerned about his children's well-being. You know, I'm going to be 60 years old. I'm going to miss everything in their lives, everything.
LaTanya Noble is Bernard's sister.
Well, this is a picture of the whole family.
The impact of Noble's imprisonment on his family has been devastating.
When my daughter told me just the amount of years he got, I thought I would just die. It's been really hard.
What's it been like for you to have your father in jail?
I mean, time precious, so I don't feel like it's right because for a bag of weed, it's just too long.
I ain't seen my dad since I was 18. He wrote me last year for my 20th birthday.
He has a son that has autism. When Bernard left, his son was 2 years old. He's now 5.
So Bernard was a breadwinner for a lot of people.
He was the provider, the main provider in that household. So with him gone, they lost their home, their independence, they lost everything.
What do you think when you see that they're selling pot legally in Colorado, but Bernard is in jail for 13 years for 3 joints?
I think they just need to change the law. They have murderers. They have people that has killed people that has less time than what Bernard has for a non-violent act. 13 years to keep a man away from his family for 3 joints, it just doesn't make sense.
Noble and his family placed a great deal of hope in marijuana reform legislation considered in the Louisiana legislature last year. It would have reduced the penalty for third-time pot possession to 5 years. The bill passed the House, but was prevented from being voted on in the Senate.
Why didn't it pass? Who was opposing it at the time?
Well, primarily it was the local law enforcement and the sheriffs.
George Stemmel, a lobbyist for the Louisiana Defense Lawyers Association, tried to get the marijuana reform legislation through. But the bill would have affected the hundreds of millions of dollars the sheriffs get from housing state inmates.
The state pays the sheriffs a per diem for each of those state inmates. And a great deal of those state inmates are serving time in local jails for drug offenses.
So the sheriffs have an economic interest in having a steady flow of inmates.
That's correct. And they also want to keep as many people on the payroll because that boosts their political popularity.
The sheriffs provide corrections jobs in the jails they run in their counties, known as parishes. They also have deals with private prison companies that house inmates.
Are jobs in prisons a big part of the jobs that sheriffs provide?
Yes. In the northern part of the state, in the rural parishes, housing state inmates have become economic development tools. While we should be producing manufacturing jobs, we're producing low-paying, low-skilled correctional workers' jobs.
Noble was sent to a parish jail run by the local sheriff in the rural northern part of the state.
We were denied permission to interview Bernard Noble here at the Concordia Parish Correctional Center. Louisiana law enforcement officials had little interest in discussing the human costs of steep pot possession penalties and the economic incentives that promote them. The district attorney that sent Noble to jail for 13 years declined our request for an interview. So did the executive director of the Louisiana Sheriff's Association, which lobbied successfully against marijuana law reform late last year.
Mass incarceration is a for-profit business. People have made millions of dollars off of incarcerating their fellow human beings.
How strong do you think those interests are in terms of pushing back against legalization?
I think they're quite strong. People don't want to see those revenue streams go. The more people you arrest and criminalize, the more you're going to need the services potentially of private entities, whether it's telephone companies, healthcare, or actual prisons themselves, to deal with this kind of mass prison industrial complex.
Do you think we've reached a tipping point in regard to pot legalization in the United States?
Even though I'm optimistic about the end of the war on marijuana, and I think that's the direction we're going in, it's going to be a hard road. And right now, if you look at the states that are contemplating or have legalized, they're predominantly on the West Coast and in the Northeast. And frankly, they're overwhelmingly white states. I think if you look at states that either have large black communities, particularly in the Deep South, or that have very segregated populations in the Midwest, that those states are further behind.
There aren't very many people that are doing time in jail or in prison for user quantities of marijuana. You know, that just, in our state, that doesn't happen. And in most places, that doesn't happen.
In Louisiana, someone who's caught with marijuana 3 times, with a joint 3 times, can go to jail for 20 years. There's no justification for that, is there?
Well, isn't that up to the people of Louisiana? If legalization is up to the people of Colorado, then why can't the people of Louisiana have it the other way if that's the way they want to have it? I mean, what we're talking about here is what people are deciding what they want to do.
That's exactly what federal legislation introduced in Washington, D.C. by Congressman Dana Rohrabacher would allow.
The main purpose of the bill is just basically to tell the federal government agencies not to interfere with state law.
Rohrabacher served as a senior speechwriter for President Ronald Reagan. It's a sign of the times that he is now an advocate for cannabis legalization.
I was very involved with trying to defeat communism, but now that communism has been defeated, I feel it's time to get back to more of a classic American view of what government should and shouldn't do. And that classical view, I believe our founding fathers were aimed at liberty. There is a downside to using marijuana, and I discourage anybody from using it. But I don't want the federal government to be involved in making those decisions for the individual.
Do you think that economic self-interest plays a role in law enforcement opposition to pot legalization?
Yeah, these people now, they just like every other government bureaucracy, it becomes a self-serving bureaucracy. People understand the military-industrial complex over there. I mean, Eisenhower warned us about that. Well, we have the same thing with drug laws.
Many argue that President Reagan was responsible for an escalation in the war on drugs. Do you think it was a mistake?
There was a greater decrease in the use of drugs by young people during the Reagan administration than at any time that this has been recorded. And that was because Reagan's whole approach was more of a positive approach, trying to convince young people that that wasn't the cool thing to do.
What do you say to those who argue that the war on drugs was targeted on people of color and that they paid the highest price for it?
I think that is that thought reflects a paranoid view of reality that doesn't exist. Reagan and the other Republicans I know probably felt they were doing people in the ghetto and in the barrio, trying to do them a favor by protecting their children from the drug dealers.
Would you agree that the war on drugs failed?
Yeah, I think the war on drugs was like the war in Iraq. You know, it was something we should not really have gotten into. One of the unintended consequences of marijuana prohibition is the fact that we have undermined honest government in various parts of the third world, especially on our own border with Mexico. We have created a flow of wealth and power into the hands of a criminal element.
Since 2006 in Mexico, the war against drug traffickers and their fight to control territory has resulted in more than 60,000 deaths and 20,000 disappearances.
De norte a sur, de este a oeste, ganaremos esta lucha, cueste lo que cueste. Porque vivas se las llevaron.
In Mexico and other Latin American countries, the legalization of marijuana is seen by many as the only way to combat the cartel violence that has traumatized families.
Mire, mis hijos desaparecieron el 28 de agosto del 2008, dos de mis hijos, que son Jesús Salvador y Raúl, este joven que llevo aquí.
¿Dónde están? These protesters were calling on the government to investigate what happened to their loved ones and for the legalization of drugs.
Así, le van a quitar el poder a toda esa gente que está utilizando ese poder para hacer todo lo que nos están haciendo. Tanto para comprar armas como para transportar su droga de un lugar a otro sin ningún problema.
Hay más muertos inclusive por la guerra que tenemos que una persona por adicción.
El tratar de conseguir la marihuana, la droga o cualquier cosa de enervantes por medios clandestinos ocasiona la violencia.
This man's son, a cafe owner, was killed because he refused to sell drugs for a Mexican trafficker.
Para que esto pare y para que esto ya no siga, tendría que haber un control, y tanto de aquí como del gobierno de Estados Unidos. Creo que lo más sano es que se pusiesen los dos gobiernos de acuerdo, legalizar la droga y evitar que siga pasando esta masacre.
A bill to legalize the production and sale of marijuana has been introduced in the Mexican Congress.
Entonces, si el gobierno no pone atención y no ve el problema como debe ser, vamos a seguir perdidos.
But so far, the proposed legislation has garnered little support. Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto is opposed. Roberto Campa, Deputy Minister of the Interior, is in charge of the Peña Nieto administration's violence prevention program.
El presidente ha planteado que él no está a favor de la legalización. México desde hace algunos años optó por la despenalización. No es lo mismo legalización que despenalización.
In Mexico, small amounts of drugs for personal use are allowed, but sales are illegal.
Many people I've spoken to say that the only way to combat the violence of the drug cartels here in Mexico is to legalize drugs, to end prohibition.
No lo sé, no tengo elementos en realidad y creo que no tenemos suficientes elementos para concluir fácilmente de esta manera.
You don't think that eliminating the market for drugs would eliminate a lot of their earnings? That it would strip them of a tremendous economic power?
Bueno, no hay duda que cortar el esquema financiero que está sustentado en la ilegalidad haría, implicaría un cambio completo en el modelo. Una parte muy importante del mercado de las drogas está vinculado con marihuana, ¿no?
Mexico's gotten hundreds of millions of dollars to fight the drug war from the United States. There are strong ties between intelligence agencies, drug fighting agencies in the United States and Mexico. Does that make it difficult for Mexico to go its own way on drug policy?
En el tema de las drogas es prácticamente imposible que algún país pueda tomar de manera aislada un paquete completo de decisiones. Pero hoy México está tomando las decisiones que corresponden a partir de sus intereses, no solamente en el análisis de la conveniencia de la legalización, sino también en el combate al narcotráfico.
It's very insignificant drug consumption in Mexico, and yet we have this war. Why? Because it's to the convenience of the United States. They want always war outside of the territory.
Vicente Fox is a businessman who was the president of Mexico from 2000 to 2006.
So Mexico is in this trap. We have paid with many lives, blood, so this has to change.
What impact do you think legalization in Colorado and Washington State are having in Mexico and in Latin America?
For the moment, it's just cultural and informative. But California is key to me. There's no way that Mexico will have the alternative of refraining to discuss and to approve the same that California approves. Otherwise, imagine Tijuana by the side of San Diego, California. I mean, if San Diego has approved and Tijuana has not, it would be a thoroughly conflicted situation.
Do you think that a tipping point in terms of the legalization of marijuana has occurred both in the United States and in Latin America?
Nobody can stop this. This is on its way. It will happen. So we better adapt our minds to the new paradigm.
Do you think that marijuana legalization will cut into the economic profits of the cartels? I mean, marijuana is only, it's
40% of the income of drugs, 40%. So it's not small. If it's 50 billion, 20 billion come from marijuana. Imagine taking that money away from cartels. You will weaken their capacities. They are not going to be able to buy the weapons that they buy in the United States and bring them to Mexico to kill kids out on the street. They are not going to be able to bribe institutions and police corps and even army in Mexico. So everything will change.
We set out to the mountainous region of Sinaloa State to assess the impact on the underground drug market of cannabis legalization in the U.S. Home of the Sinaloa cartel, the area is one of the main marijuana-producing regions in Mexico. Sinaloa farmers grow a high-quality strain of pot known as chronic.
De 5,000 a 6,000 plantas tengo aquí en el plantillo este.
The farmers sell the marijuana to the highest bidder for transport to the U.S.
Ya en unos 8 días está ya para la cosecha ya.
How much is it worth?
Un valor de 25,000 a 30,000 pesos.
The percentage of drug cartel profits that come from marijuana sales are a matter of debate. But the cannabis now being raised legally in the U.S. is already having an effect on profits from pot.
Están cultivando allá pues y nos están dando la madre que nosotros.
What impact has the spread of medical marijuana had on the price down here in Mexico?
Ya no vienen gente a traer dinero pues para comprar, ya no tiene valor. Antes valía hasta 1,000 pesos un kilo y ahora vale 500 pesos la calidad, la buena.
If they legalize marijuana in the United States, do you think it's going to impact your life a lot down here?
Sí, no, claro que pues ya nadie va a querer sembrar, que pues ya está cabrón. De por sí nadie queremos sembrar porque vale muy barato el kilo ya.
Do you think the legalization of drugs will combat violence here in Mexico?
Well, probablemente.
To say that you're going to eliminate the black market, you're going to eliminate the criminal activity by legalizing it, I don't think that's true.
Violence diminished dramatically when alcohol prohibition ended.
I think a lot of things have changed since prohibition. Criminal activity has gotten to be a lot more sophisticated. There's a lot of money to be made off marijuana. They're making a lot of money off methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and the other drugs too.
Wouldn't it weaken them like it weakened Al Capone during Prohibition?
I don't know how to answer that question really, Bob.
I think it put them out of business. And that's the purpose of it, is to reduce the crime and violence and stop the killing. People are dying, in this drug trade in Central and South America in staggering numbers compared to the United States.
In Uruguay, combating drug cartel violence was a major aim of a cannabis legalization campaign last year.
La lucha entre grupos vinculados al narcotráfico genera más violencia en nuestro país. Regular el mercado de marihuana reducirá este tipo de violencia.
The campaign was mounted in support of legalization legislation pushed by Uruguay's president, José Mujica.
Es una medida de ensayo contra el narcotráfico. Emplear otros métodos, porque hasta ahora lo que nos presenta el mundo no da solución.
Last December, Uruguay became the first country in the world to legalize the production and sale of recreational marijuana.
Queda aprobado en general el proyecto de ley.
The cannabis legalization effort was spearheaded by Mujica's presidential secretary, Diego Canepa.
El inicio de la producción y que estará en los puntos de ventas a partir alrededor del mes de septiembre del año 2014.
In Denver last year, Canepa and other Latin American officials participated in the Drug Policy Alliance's meeting of legalization advocates.
We are working very hard to move from Vienna to New York. Some part of the discussion is very important for us.
Latin American leaders have convinced the UN to hold a special 2016 session on drugs and the drug war.
The war on drugs that started with the Nixon speech in 1971 is not giving out a good result in the region. We totally agree, all of us. Different governments, from the right, from the left, from the center.
What role do you think Uruguay can play and is playing in the rethinking of the war on drugs?
The better way that we can help people in the world is to show our policy results better for the population. So you can discuss, say, okay, Uruguay choose to change the policy, choose to have a radical movement, and now we have better results. Why we don't do it?
In the U.S., this is very much a grassroots movement, pardon the pun. Conversely, in Latin America, barely a third of the public actually supports legalizing marijuana. But you have elected officials, presidents, providing real leadership.
Do you think marijuana legalization is the beginning of the end of the drug war?
Yes. I think marijuana legalization is the beginning of the end. But it's not like bringing down the Berlin Wall. That wall crumbled awfully fast when it finally came down, So there's a long way to go. But there's a powerful argument which says that the war on marijuana subsidizes the rest of the war on drugs. If marijuana is taken out of the picture, a lot of the cops barely have anything to do anymore.
As police officers, we don't make the law, we enforce the law. If they change the law, we are stuck with what the law is.
What do you think would be the most persuasive thing to happen to prevent legalization? If things go badly in Colorado and Washington State?
I think we're going to see some of that, yes. I think eventually we're going to get to a point far enough down the road where people are going to understand what the real dangers and the damage is.
Do you expect to see pot being sold on Bourbon Street during your lifetime?
I don't expect to see it in Louisiana anytime soon. It may never happen without the federal government getting involved and saying, hey, marijuana's off the list. I think if that happens, then you create a sort of catalyst effect, not just for Louisiana, but everywhere else.
If it was a secret ballot, the legalizing marijuana would pass with a very strong majority here. But people are afraid that their position will be misrepresented in an advertising campaign against them in their very next election.
Do you expect to see 25 states legalize pot in your lifetime?
Yes.
Do you think that the legalization of marijuana is the beginning of the end of the drug war?
It is a waste of resources to take our police, our courts, our jails, and put people in them whose only crime was either trying to smoke some weed that you can grow in your backyard or trying to sell someone something for them to smoke. We're going broke. I think we've reached a point where there can be a reevaluation as to what the benefits are of channeling resources of our federal government into marijuana or the war on drugs.